From studios at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, this is Fourth and State.
Hi, I'm Ernie Franzen. I'm the Associate Editorial Page Editor at the Journal Sentinel. The editorial board is joined today by reporters and editors and by Governor Scott Walker, who's here to talk about his budget. Welcome to Fourth and State.
Good to be back.
Let's start with the centerpiece of your budget speech was the tax cut in your budget. But estimates are that tax cut averages out to about $108 over the year for a family, or for a two-income family. Why is that more important than, say, putting the money in a rainy day fund or transportation or some other needs the state has?
Well, I think if you look at the balance, what we did is an interesting comparison if you take a step back from 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we had over a $3 billion deficit. Now we have about a $500 million surplus. We have positive revenue growth, although conservative estimates in our budget, but still positive revenue growth projected for the next 2 years. And so I tried to do it in a series of areas: creating jobs, developing the workforce, transforming education, making reforms in our government, and making investments in our infrastructure. So you mentioned transportation. There's about a $6.4 billion investment in transportation infrastructure in this budget. There's about $100 million in workforce development. But when it comes to income taxes, one of the things I said when the original estimates came out in, November last year, of about a $340 million surplus, it got bigger, was that we targeted that for income tax relief. And we tried, it goes to everyone who pays taxes, but we tried to drive it into the middle income areas, because that's where we looked at the bracket by bracket comparisons around the country. That's where we have some of the highest levels in terms of compared to other states. And as I mentioned in my speech, it's really a down payment. This is not the last. My goal is this is a down payment on future tax relief. We've done it over the last 2 years when it comes to property taxes after significant increases in the previous decade. We'd like to do it when it comes to income tax relief, both for individuals, as you mentioned, so it's more money in their pocket versus the trend before, which was taxes going up. And just came across the street from Manufacturing Matters. Most of our small and mid-sized companies, manufacturing and otherwise, are LLCs or S-corps who pay individual income taxes, not corporate. And so they would benefit as well. And for them, and got a lot of validation from the crowd when I said this, when companies like that get more money back in hand from the government, most of that gets plowed into new equipment, which puts people to work, which has a tremendously positive impact. In fact, on top of the individual income taxes in total, there's about $630 million worth of tax relief in the budget. A good chunk of the remainder of that is the fulfillment of the commitment we made 2 years ago in terms of the manufacturing and agricultural tax credit, which will be a tremendous driver for two of our key industries in the state. So, to your point, we provided tax relief, we provide investment in workforce investment, we put in place some education reforms, we did some transformation or reform in government, and we made a significant investment in infrastructure. Because of our tough but prudent decisions over the last 2 years, unlike some of our neighbors, Illinois and Minnesota in particular, we're able to do that.
Do you think it'll have much effect on consumer spending? It's only a few bucks a week.
Well, I think it'll have some impact just in terms of the trend. People see the taxes going down versus going up. But the larger impact, I think, is what it means for small businesses and other employers in terms of what that'll do, not just in terms of consumer growth, but in terms of the impact that it has, again, on these small businesses who now can take those monies that they otherwise would be paying in additional taxes, and by and large, you can't guarantee every single one of them, but I think the large number of them will be putting that back into reinvesting in their company.
Okay.
Marty Kaiser, editor. Switch topics. Yesterday, Police Chief Flynn was in Washington. We know you've been a strong supporter of availability for citizens of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. You've also been a strong supporter of law enforcement. So yesterday when the chief was in Washington, his comments were incredibly passionate. I don't know if you saw the video.
Heard about it.
You say passionate. Others saw it rude. Talk about that, but what he said is, for the first 20 years of my police career, I carried a 6-shooter, and that was plenty. In the last 20 years, we've been in an arms race. And he also talked about 7 of his officers being shot from semi-automatic weapons in the last 3 years. And then he said it's time for Congress to pick a side. I hope it's law enforcement. Chief Flynn were sitting here today, what would you say to him?
Well, within the state, from our standpoint, I do think we need to put them on a better ground. The question is, what's the best way to do that?
How do you mean put them on a better ground?
Well, put them in a better position. I think the problem is that the people who are committing those crimes are by their nature criminals. And so having or not having access to that legally, it's hard to imagine that there won't be a supply of firearms just because certain things are banned from manufacturers if the people who are using or committing crimes in the first place, that other laws didn't prevent them, didn't create a deterrent. So I look at that and say, what should be done to make sure that criminals don't have access to firearms? Now, in our state, we already obviously have felons are prohibited from purchasing firearms, but what more things can be done to prevent access, to crack down, to create greater penalties? There's any number of things that can be done in that regard. I don't know that just having a new ban on one particular type of firearm versus another alone is going to be the solution.
Why does it seem so many police chiefs can't understand that, what you're saying?
Oh, no, that's not understand. I think from their standpoint, I understand. They're looking and saying, I'll take any and all options out there. Take a step back after what the tragedy that happened in Connecticut, followed after what happened in Oak Creek and Brookfield and others. I tried to look at that and say at the time there were some who said there needs to be gun control. There were some on the other end of the spectrum who said we need to require that there are armed personnel in every school. And I didn't jump on either of those two. I
So
said,
you're not on the Sheriff Clark's side or the
and
Chief Flynn's side?
here's the reason why, is I said in both cases I think they give a somewhat false sense of security in the sense that neither of those alone will do that. What I looked at there was trying to say, what's the common denominator, whether it was in Oak Creek, whether it was in Brookfield, whether it was in Connecticut or Aurora, or a month ago when the young man came in with a backpack full of Molotov cocktails into our state capitol looking to cause harm, or years ago in Oklahoma City. It wasn't a firearm because in some cases you had explosives, in other cases you had firearms and different types of firearms. What was common was chronically long-term, untreated, unassisted mental health problems. And said to me, and we had started looking at mental health expansion long before that, but it just put an exclamation point on the need for us to be more aggressive, at least here in the state of Wisconsin. It's why we invested nearly $30 million in our budget in mental health care to spread successful programs to every county in the state. The most, I think, we put in as far as we checked, in almost 30 years. Because to me, that's the one common denominator in terms of these tragedies out there, is people who've gotten to that point largely because they've had untreated conditions that we need to do a better job of addressing.
But a lot of people committing these crimes are not mentally ill. There are shootings that take place all over the U.S. and they're not mentally ill. So you say you want to take guns out of criminals' hands, but it's not happening. And we have massive homicides every year. So what can the police count on? What can you offer?
Well, you're right, and there's two different parts. When I talk about some of the tragic cases, that's where the chronic untreated mental illness is. In the other cases of crime, there's got to be an ability to have a larger crackdown on crime, period. It wasn't like we went from a shift years ago when there was an assault ban and everything was crime-free to suddenly when that expired, there wasn't. If somebody could show me that there was low crime and then suddenly when the assault ban changed, it suddenly went up again, it didn't. It's been consistently, sadly, high here and across the country. And so if that alone was the solution, why wouldn't we have seen a greater drop when that was in effect a decade or so ago? To me, there's something more to it. It's not just that ban that's the issue. It's the larger issue of how do you address the criminal element.
Is it giving more resources to police? Spending more?
It may be.
Most of what you're saying is very similar to what Congressman Ryan said when he was here a couple of weeks ago, except for he did say he was open to having background checks for gun shows. Do you agree or disagree with Congressman Ryan on that?
I think that makes some sense, but I think if they're going to address issues like that, it's got to be addressed nationally. Because if you just do it state by state, it's the same concerns.
But you would support background checks for purchases at gun shows?
Well, I think some way of having, we've had a successful background check program here in the state. If there was some way to address that on a national basis that could provide that same sort of objective consistency, that would be good because it's worked really effectively here in the state of Wisconsin. And it's actually something that we expanded. In fact, I helped expand it when I was first in the legislature, where it was just for felons. In fact, you might remember being involved with us as well when there was a shooting of Dale Brightwell, the vice principal at West, we expanded it to include people who had been adjudicated for crimes as juveniles, so they weren't precluded from being prohibited from purchasing firearms as well. To me, that makes some sense.
Can we talk about jobs for a second?
Sure.
That was a big campaign promise for you. Obviously, you're not quite on track at this point with that.
Yeah.
The Senate passed the mining bill yesterday, and yet even if that goes through without court challenges and everything else, it'll be a while before those jobs come
Absolutely.
online. What are you doing now?
A whole
to
series of
create
things. I mean,
jobs?
part of what we just talked about over here at Manufacturing Matters, but it's everything from new money for capital catalyst program to help startup companies like the two I mentioned in my State of the State address. It's the additional investment we made in investment capital to try and help not only startup but emerging companies. It's expanded economic development credits that tie into angel investors and others that are out there. It's trying to change in terms of both in the short term and the long term workforce development because Monarch being a good example of a company here in the Milwaukee area where if they had more high-skilled welders and machinists, they would not only plug the holes that they have today or have had in the past, they'd actually probably add an additional shift, as many employers have talked about. But many employers are reluctant to add shifts if they don't have an adequate supply of workers for the skills they have open today, let alone those they might take on in the future. So it's a number of things. It's even investments in infrastructure. I mean, we put additional money in for the harbor assistance, so whether it's Milwaukee or Green Bay or Superior, much of our export potential, which was up 4.7% versus 4.5% nationally, is dependent on having a good, strong intermodal system of ports, freight rail, highways and bridges, and others out there. So it's not just one silver bullet, but it's a multitude of things.
Given all that, why isn't the mining bill your number one priority?
Well, I think it's a part of it. I mean, it's not only for the jobs related to that, because, North Star's estimate are not only at the mine, which is about 700 jobs first phase, 1,400 second or finishing phase. What is it, about 3,000 jobs for the construction, about 2,800 permanently. That's a huge part of it. But to me, that's one piece. The symbolism of what that says to other employers, not just for people who get mining-related jobs, is important because it says we found a way to streamline the process for safe and environmentally sound mining in the state of Wisconsin. Doesn't mean there's a mine today. Doesn't mean it's going to happen today. But we found a way to streamline that process. And I found some of the things that we do that have been doing and continue to do that have some of the biggest impact on employers aren't pieces of legislation. They're things like the changes we made in the DNR and training all of our top management in Lean Six Sigma so that DNR employees are out more aggressively as partners with our employers, not backing away from environmental standards, but saying, let's find a way to comply up front, be more like a consultant than an adversary, and find a way to deal with employers because on having a more common sense approach on enforcing our regulations, on reining in some of the frivolous and out of control lawsuits, things like that have as big of an impact or greater than just what your tax burden is.
Mm-hmm. Do you regret running on that 250,000 jobs? It's going to be very tough for you to get anywhere near that.
It is, but
I mean, it was a great campaign tactic, but is it something that you wish you hadn't done, or that you wish you had done lower numbers on?
No, I think you got to have high standards, and I think you got to have high goals. And the analogy I use is my youngest son's still at Wawatos East. He's a smart kid, just got into the University of Wisconsin as well as Marquette in engineering. Great kid, smart kid, should be on the honor roll all the time. A couple years ago, he was out sick for about a week for a while and got a little behind on stuff. And could he have made the excuse, hey, Dad, I've been out, I'm behind, legitimate reasons, some stuff got tied up. It's going to be hard to get on the honor roll this year. Sure, that'd be legitimate. There'd be a convincing case to be made about that. But I know he can hit the honor roll. So we dug down deep. We helped him out, hunkered down. He continued to do the good work he was doing out there and helped him out. And in the same way, could you make a convincing case, aside from the national economy, just after a year of protest, after first wave of recalls, after my recall, after the problems we see nationally, after the fiscal cliff and now the sequester debate, after all the concerns that I hear repeatedly about healthcare and healthcare mandates and what that means, sure, could you make a convincing case? But you haven't heard me say in any of it that that's an excuse to say we're not going to get 250,000.
So what are the chances that you can get to 250?
we're still operating on full speed ahead that we're going to get there. And think about it. Why did I make that promise in the first place, which goes to your question, Dan? Because from 2008 to 2010, I saw us lose 150,000 jobs. And so it's not just a statistic or a number. I just saw the devastation that it made to many of our communities, whether it's Racine or Sheboygan or the northern part of Milwaukee or other places where there's high unemployment, and said, we've got to aim high because in the end, even if you get to 235,000, whatever the magic number is, hopefully more, that's 200 and some thousand more families where somebody's a breadwinner, where somebody's got a job that didn't have a job before, where that has an impact not just on that household, but on that community, on that neighborhood, and ultimately on the state. And it's interesting, on a couple of these issues, my opponents, politically, ignore all the losses we had before and focus on, are we on pace or not, when no one can deny we're up from where we were prior to my taking office. Just like, and I thought the Snine did a good job of fairly articulating the income tax yesterday in the cut, or in the story about the cuts, about yes, where they go, but who pays what and how. I thought it was a pretty fair story. I mean, I wouldn't have written it myself that way, but I thought, total fairness, it was pretty straightforward. I would have said everything was great and it was wonderful, and we're all and this will lead us to 250,000 jobs.
Jason had that in there.
Yeah, that's right. Just read in between the lines. But I thought it was pretty fair because it said, yeah, okay, certain people are going to get it. That's because they pay a whole lot more in taxes. But in the end, the percentage target is still at the middle and lower income part of the income tax. Well, I'm saying it the same way with the jobs issue. It's interesting to me that then some of the people who've commented on that say, well, it's not enough of an income tax cut for this group or that group, are the same people who 3 years ago voted for $1 billion tax increase. I mean, it's interesting to me how we sometimes forget the context of which we're in. I think the good news is for taxpayers and for people who want job growth, we're going from debating how many jobs we're losing and how high our taxes are going to how much our tax relief is and where it's going to be targeted and how many more jobs are we going to have over the jobs we've lost before. I think in total, that's optimistic, and that's why, per your question, Dan, why I have high goals on each of those things, because if you don't, people in Madison, just like people in Washington, will always find a way to underperform. I'm going to aim high because I want to keep overperforming.
Governor, both publicly and privately, city officials have said you've given the city of Milwaukee short shrift, both during your first few years as well as in the new budget. Transform Milwaukee had the lion's share of the money was committed to a hotel and a water council development. There's $2.5 million for Transform Milwaukee in your new budget. They accuse you of ignoring the foreclosure crisis, and now we have the residency rule. Are you a friend of the city of Milwaukee?
Absolutely. I'm a friend of the taxpayers. I'm a friend of the people. I'm a friend of the job creators. Politically, I may not be aligned with everything that some of the city leaders have, but in the end, the people in Milwaukee will fare better because of my tenure as governor. Just hands down.
How so?
More jobs, lower taxes, better economy. Not as good as we'd like because we're improving, but a lot better than where we were before I was governor. And so it's interesting on each of those issues. I mean, it's interesting that foreclosure being an example. You look at all the states that took foreclosure money. In Wisconsin, about 82% of that goes directly to the homeowners, of which the vast majority are Milwaukee. Of the three major programs that WIDA has, 2 of the 3 are exclusively in the city of Milwaukee. When you look at other states across America, there are 20 states who spend 50% or less on home-related options, and 6 of which spend it entirely on state government. We spent a fraction of that on state government because state government, just like homeowners and others, had the negative impact, and we were the ones that brought that lawsuit. So it's one of those where, unfortunately, I think sometimes some of the leaders here don't want to deal with the issues that they have before them. They're looking for somebody else to blame about the challenges they face instead of facing those head on.
What would you tell them to do?
Yeah.
What tell them to
What
do?
would you tell the city leaders to do? You say instead of them blaming the Walker administration, what would you tell them to address?
What should they do?
I'd focus on things that improve the quality of life in the city of Milwaukee. And again, I'm not going to do anything about this from the state standpoint, but a good example, still living in the metropolitan areas. I'd spend my time and resources on economic development projects that put people to work instead of a streetcar that'll affect a handful of people on the Upper East Side of Milwaukee. I'd spend more time focusing on helping develop jobs and improving the climate, streamline the process, as opposed to picking battles either at the state or the federal level, finding ways to invest, particularly in corridors where there's high unemployment. It's what we tried to do with Empower Milwaukee. We'd like to do more. It hasn't met every one of our challenges, but that's something we did because we saw something we initiated because we didn't see the city of Milwaukee doing enough to help the city of Milwaukee, and we tried to connect it from particularly a transportation background.
But $62 million of your $100 million initiative are over here downtown, a hotel and a water council. The problem is in the central city.
Yeah. So
So I'd say the counter. So is the city saying we shouldn't spend that money on that project? I mean, the reality is we did, and that will create jobs in Milwaukee. We didn't take that money and say, okay, we're going to spend it in Superior. We still sent it in the city of Milwaukee. So it seems to me, instead of dealing with the issues that are out there, they're looking for people to blame. We're making investments in Milwaukee, and what they're saying, much like I mentioned before, where I said taxes went up before I was governor, I'm now lowering, and so instead of saying that's good, some detractors are saying, no, you're not cutting them enough in these groups. Jobs were lost before, they're now increasing under my administration, and they're saying, well, that's not enough, they should be higher, even though when we presided, they were going down. Here, what I hear is you're investing money in Milwaukee, but you're not investing enough, or you're not investing in the right areas. Well, again, we're investing in areas where people are asking for help in the city of Milwaukee, unlike the past where that money just wasn't there.
Well, what about Century City? What kind of investment are you really making to that area? Because that's an area of high unemployment. That's an area that was at one time booming in the 1950s and 60s. It was a place where people could make a livable wage, buy homes, send their kids to college, all that stuff. And you said something about a major commitment there, but I haven't seen it materialize.
Well, right. Our focus is on having that money available, but you can't do it without projects. I mean, it's our commitment is to have that money available within the corridor, of which the two projects that Don alluded to are within that corridor. Some may want them in different parts of it, but again, these are about leveraging not just public dollars, but private dollars as well. And so the project downtown and the water incubator, which for years you guys have all editorialized, the Water Council is a good thing. Water is one of those emerging technologies. You know, half of all the top 12 centers of water excellence are right here. 150 of the water-based companies are all here. We made that project possible. Wouldn't have happened with the city of Milwaukee. It happened because of WIDA and the involvement of the state of Wisconsin. So, and I'm not saying you're saying that, James, but I'm saying, so we're investing in things that leaders, not Madison, but Milwaukee, have said for years are priorities. We need projects, we need development, but the state alone can't do it. Those are things where, per not only your question, but Don's as well, if city leaders came and said, hey, we've got a developer, we've got a project in this part of the city, and whether it's there or it's near the old A.L. Smith plant or anywhere else, we'd be more than willing to look at that. But we alone can't generate those. We're not looking at sole investments from the state or from WIDA. We're looking about investments we can make in private ventures where we provide a significant financial impact to help drive those projects forward.
Governor, on schools, a lot
But Jim, just one follow-up. Your point's a valid one, but I can't stress it enough. But that's where, if the city wants to be engaged in that, come to us with projects and say, here are things we should do. It's not our role, nor should it be, for us to come in and...
Is that communication taking place? It seems like, when you talk to the city, they, say, well, we're doing our effort, but what is the state doing? So,
But you're right to say generic. I mean, list the project where we have said no, a viable project. I mean, even I'll give you one more step. Look at what we're doing with the Home Bridge. Now, we don't need to do this. There's nothing that obligated this. We are dramatically changing the takedown of the on and off ramps off the Home Bridge. Why? Because a number of leaders here, not just Rocky Murco, but private sector leaders who many have talked to you, from the folks from Northwestern Mutual and downtown and We Energies and Michael Cuddy and all have said we need an open gate view of the lakefront. That's a great development opportunity. There's tremendous potential there. It'll be a great way to put a signature mark on the city of Milwaukee. We didn't have to do that. That's considerable cost to us. In most cases, when we take up and down on and off ramps, we partner with the given community. We're ultimately going to pick up the tab for that. Why? Because we think it makes sense. We understand the city, unfortunately, is not in a viable position to do what other communities do, and that is partner in the cost of those on and off ramps going down. But we think that's a pretty big, important deal. Now, is it in the areas that you mentioned? No, but it is. When we get asked what are our priorities, where our focus point, these are things that people bring to us, and these are things that we've supported.
Governor, on schools, two questions. They're probably related. On choice, why did you roll out choice to school districts where apparently you didn't talk to the school boards? Mm-hmm. And secondly, a lot of your voters live in Elmbrook. And the Elmbrook School District, according to this story, is bracing for a new state budget with a potential $2.3 million deficit in their school budget. So choice, and are you sticking it to Elmbrook and other county districts?
Multitude parts on there. On the choice part, the choice for us was driven by performance. I mean, not just in choice, but overall in the budget. We put money in for high-performing schools. We put money in for high-growth schools. In fact, one of the things that hasn't been reported, but the city of Milwaukee, the MPS school district, would get $7.2 million more, assuming the report card stayed the same. Now, if they improved, it would vary. But just from schools that fail to meet expectations. That would be additional money that would be accessible to MPS, but with the caveat being is that it would have to be released. They would have to submit a fundamental turnaround plan to DPI. So this would empower the superintendent to really invoke some fundamental changes that would come with getting that money. Plus, they actually have, you guys know this, but not everybody in Wisconsin knows it. They have a number of schools that are high performers and that are rapid growth schools, we estimate, and they would get additional monies for that. So in total, estimate-wise, again, assuming the numbers work out to be about $9 million, they get between the performance incentives and about the $7.2 million and change that they'd be eligible for because of schools that fail to meet expectation. That money's all driven trying to stay on performance. Our goal, my kids both went to Wauwatosa Public Schools. I went to Delavan Darien High School and public schools there. My nieces go to Waukesha, City of Waukesha Public Schools. I want to improve public schools. That's where the vast majority of kids are in the state. I want to see performance there, but I don't want to limit it that. Now, I want to make sure that every kid in the state has access to great education. And in schools where they have, or school districts where they have schools that fail to meet expectations, I'm going to give them the ability and the resources needed to fundamentally turn them around. But I'm also going to give, under our proposal, we're going to give parents in those districts the ability to choose an alternative if their son or daughter is going to a failing school. Now, are we willing to go negotiate, not just for I think you guys raised some of the comments in your editorial, but some of the senators have said that, whether it's working with Luther Olson or Mike Ellis or others, if they want to more narrowly target that and not just say it's open by district, but it's targeted to the school where parents' sons or daughters would be headed into a school that's failing to meet expectations, a failing school. We're willing to work with that because our goal is to help kids who are failing. If you want to tie it into income, that's something worth talking about because that's how the choice program started here in Milwaukee more than 2 decades ago. That higher wealth individuals had a choice. They could pay to send their son or daughter to a private school, and those who were low income didn't have that choice. So,
can I bring you back to the two questions, though, please?
But why
didn't you consult with the school boards of these 9 districts? Apparently you didn't. So if I'm sitting on a school board, you're all about local control. Shouldn't they be upset? The governor tells them what to do.
We're not telling them what to do with choice. We're telling them if their schools districts don't have any schools that fail to meet expectations, students in that district aren't going to be eligible for choice.
And then on Elmbrook,
so it's not a question. They don't have to sign off on it. This is not an issue that's under the domain. This is saying that the education of our students, the ensuring that every kid in the state has access to great education, is bigger than just a school district.
So you're taking away local control? Is that what's going on?
No, we're not. We're not telling them what they have to do with the schools. The control goes right to that family. Ultimately, in the same way that Tommy Thompson didn't talk to the MPS school board of directors about school choice back in the 90s, he said, I'm going to empower families, particularly low-income families whose sons or daughters are heading into schools that are failing to meet expectations, to have a viable alternative. That wasn't something they
May I jump in just on that? I can remember sitting in assembly. You were in there when the governor was making pitches like that. That one of the major arguments for choice was that it would make MPS better. I look at MPS now, and I look at MPS 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Is it better, and did that work?
I think in some schools it is. I think in others it's not.
As a system, MPS today, is it better than when school choice started?
Well, is it better? Not necessarily. How much worse would it have been? It's debatable. To me, I think the bigger argument isn't whether it improves the district or not. It's will it improve the lives of those students who are given that choice? To me, whether it's a choice to go to a traditional public school, whether it's a charter school, whether it's a virtual school, or whether it's a voucher school, if we're all about choices, I mean, we had a couple weeks ago at National School Choice Week, we had NPS schools there, we had charter schools, we had choice schools there. Why? Because we highlighted schools that were successful. I'd like to see it's why Dr. Evers and I brought into the mix when we created the school and school district accountability system task force that spent about a year putting together what's now in those report cards. We included not only teachers and parents and officials from public schools as well as private sector folks. We included folks from the choice schools and the private schools. Why? Because going forward, and this will be done through separate legislation, we'd like to have any school that gets public money or has access to public money that follows the students should be under the report cards, because we want parents to have access to that. Because I think even in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, there are great schools and there are schools that aren't so great. Notre Dame and St. Marcus, two schools I highlighted in my budget address, I think are great schools that far exceed in both math and science, or excuse me, math and reading, are about 50% higher than their equivalent MPS schools. Those are schools that clearly are succeeding. In other cases, there are those that aren't, and if parents had information about that, they could choose.
You can get back to his question on why you're stick at Elm Brook.
Well, yeah, on Elm Brook and other districts like that, they had the tools the last time with collective bargaining and the medical. Okay, the tools are gone now. How are they supposed to close the $2.3 million deficit?
Well, in their case, schools like that are different. That's a school aid formula issue that goes beyond our budget or not. I mean, they're a district, and there's a handful like that only get aided at a certain level. For example, some of the proposals on the table would make that even worse if you moved even more money away from high property value districts into other lower property value districts across the state. But there are options they have. There are things they can do in terms of school referendum if they want to spend things they can build. And not all their tools are exhausted in any school district across the state. Some, like Milwaukee, Kenosha, and others where the contracts are up, have a much broader spectrum. Others that the contracts came up sooner, they can act on. But every school district still has options on the table in terms of what they do in scheduling, on work rules, on overtime, as well as the things they've done in the past with pension and healthcare contribution.
Speaking of local control, one of the items in the budget would remove local communities' ability to put in residency requirements. Aren't you imposing the state's will on that? And why is that a matter for the budget? Isn't it a policy issue that should be discussed separately?
Two different parts. One on the residency, and this is not a new position for me. I debated this when I was in the legislature. I authored the bill more than a decade ago to get rid of residency for MPS teachers, so it's pretty consistent with it. I just believe there's local control, and there's control that's even more fundamental than just government. It's ultimately to the people. You're empowering the people at a local level. In the sense, to me, if a local government wants to impose a radius requirement or a distance requirement and say that you should be within 15 minutes of your office or your station, that's one thing. But obviously in Milwaukee, that's not a practical argument against lifting residency, because most public employees live in the far southwest, far northwest, or down that little strip down the middle. And in fact, many public employees would be closer to the place they work at if they lived in the east side of Wauwatosa or Brown Deer or St. Francis than they currently live in the city of Milwaukee. So just philosophically, I think, and from a freedom standpoint, people should have the freedom to live and work where they choose, that you should decide employment based upon merit and not based on an arbitrary guideline that reflects a boundary. Why is it practical to put it in the budget? I think it's simple. It goes back to the discussion, Bill, we were just having about schools. So much of what I focus on education in this budget and overall is based on performance. I mentioned more than a decade ago, having introduced the bill in MPS. MPS's problem getting enough qualified teachers is not unique to this year. It's been around for decades, and residency is not the only issue. So don't get me wrong. I'm not going to tell you that if you change residency at all, correct it overnight, but it's a big part of it. From a practical standpoint, I think more than anything, that's the driving force. If we're putting all these changes in to try and improve, to give more tools to our schools, particularly MPS and others, why not give them one more tool? Because that fits into our overall success. And then if you're making that change for MPS, which I think this paper's editorialized made some sense in the past, why not be consistent for everybody, not just in Milwaukee, but across the state?
Governor, and casino gambling.
And just one, sorry, I'll come right back to that, but just one other thing on this, you didn't ask about it, but one other point that I thought the opposing view you ran today very articulately pointed out, and that is, in other places that don't have it or have changed it, it doesn't create the exodus that some in city government complain. I mean, you look at a city like Indianapolis, it's a great city. You look at other cities across the country, their challenges aren't because they have or don't have residency. There are plenty of other issues, and we should have plenty of positive reasons to live, work, play in the city of Milwaukee, not because there's an arbitrary guideline in terms of boundaries. So I just don't see that. And I've said practically, you all know this as homeowners, nobody's going to walk away from a home that they've invested that has $150,000 in it. If most are not going to, but if they do, they're going to sell it for what it's worth. They're not going to take a loss just to move out of the city of Milwaukee. But anyway.
Okay.
On casino gambling,
Yep.
The Menominee proposal for Kenosha, it's going through D.C., looks like it's going to get through. The smart money is betting on it will be approved. Then it
I'm
comes
not
to
a
you,
gambler, but
I don't have money on it either. But, then it will be on your desk.
not pulling a Pete Rose and covering and betting on it too.
No, we don't do that.
No, I was always a Cubs fan, not a Reds fan. But every time an off-reservation proposal comes through, there's a in the past to your predecessors, there's been a free flow of campaign contributions, special interest money so far, and so on and so forth. Back when you were in the Assembly, you proposed a bill that would have prevented anybody with an interest in gaming in a casino or dog track from making contributions. Do you still opposed to those parties making any types of political contributions?
I mean,
Or would you accept the money from them?
I don't know that there's a whole lot of interest in giving me direct money on any of those things, but per a couple things you mentioned there. One, on the proposal, I heard last year it'll be by January 1. It's now a day away from March 1. I've heard for years now it was going to come just around the corner. Every time I meet with the 11 leaders of the sovereign nations in the state, on my quarterly meetings with them, the issue comes up, as you can imagine.
But what about the contribution question? Is that something that would still be a position that...
I'd look at it. I mean, it's one of those issues I kicked around a long time ago, and as you can tell, it went absolutely nowhere. It didn't. I don't even think at the time got out of committee or that. For me, it's pretty straightforward. Whatever people may be doing, contribution, advertising-wise or otherwise, I said almost 2 years ago, actually it was exactly 2 years ago, I think it was the February meeting, if I remember right, that I had up at Lac de Flambeau with the tribal leaders when I was first asked what my position was on any expansion. I said there are three guiding principles. One is there's got to be local support. Two is I said there has to be consensus amongst the tribal leaders. And some people since then, and I've had to further clarify, didn't get what consensus means. Consensus doesn't mean 10 yes, 1 no. Consensus means everybody says yes.
So it's unanimous.
Yeah. To me, it's hard to say it's a consensus and then say, but 4 of these other here don't agree with it. And third, I've said there's got to be some way, and I'm somewhat loose on this of how to define it because it's been so long, but remember almost 20 years ago, the people of the state voted on, I believe at the time it was 5 advisory referendum questions on gaming, and one of them was on expansion, and they said no. And so to me, I don't know that expansion goes down to the exact specific, how many tables do you have, but in terms of operations, if they were going to have one somewhere else, to me it would mean there'd have to be one somewhere else that would close down if you were going to have an even number expansion. Alternatively, I suppose we could have an updated referendum or advisory referendum question on it to measure 20 years later what the response is in that. But those are the criteria I laid out. To me, That's what I said then. I repeated it again. I even said it late last year when I was down in front of the Kenosha's paper's editorial board, which obviously was not welcome news there. But my position on this is pretty clear. No matter what group I'm in front of, I've consistently said the same thing.
So are you saying for the tribal consensus, any one of the 11 tribes could veto the Menominee or any other off-reservation
Yeah, to me a
proposal?
consensus is, if I say let's create a consensus and you guys, a couple of you walk away saying I don't agree, that's not a consensus.
So anyone does have veto power?
Yeah.
And
Because what I've tried to encourage on those is say, because otherwise, and my argument there is, otherwise you got all these different competing interests that are amongst the tribal governments that are not just, Milwaukee and Kenosha is the most specific right now, but you've got similar issues in Beloit or Shullsburg with the Ho-Chunk in Madison and Baraboo. You've got potentially interest in Sheboygan that would impact the Oneida in Hobart. I mean, you open the door without that sort of criteria. Now, do they say, is that a difficult, wall to hurdle? Absolutely. But to me, I mean, and people said, how is that, one of the other concerns someone said at one of these meetings was, well, how does that not, square with trying to make it, open for business? I said, well, the difference here is there's something to be said for the premium of having exclusive rights over gaming in the state. If you want to be open for business, I don't know the legislature would do this, the true way to do that would be to say if you're going to have gaming, it should be open to anybody. And I don't think that's what any of the 11 sovereign nations want either.
so the way to do it, though, would be if one tribe, say Menominee, shared the wealth with the other 10.
Or find some way to work it out. Well, I think specific, again, you have here Kenosha and Milwaukee, but it would be true in these other areas. The reasons that established operations would be reluctant to have operations nearby is obvious. They, anywhere in the state, they don't want, they figure they've got an established, establishment that's successful, that's profitable, that puts people to work. I was not a big fan years ago when the Forest County Potawatomi suggested coming here in Milwaukee. I've actually been relatively pleasantly surprised in terms of the impact they've had on this community in terms of jobs and charitable contributions to others out there. So, I mean, there can be positive things out there, but I think in any of these cases, there's got to be a careful path because this is such an exclusive area of interest. If it was just anybody could do it under any circumstances, it would be different.
I was just going to follow up on his very first question about the tax cut. The budget bill you submitted has an estimate that the structural deficit will be $188 million in the hole by 2015. You're borrowing $800 million to help pay for roads. We've been told that we should think of government as a household and how we run the finances. Is this credit card type of management of government, or how do you explain giving a tax cut at the front end that has a deficit at the back end?
Well, a couple of things. One, if you look at the budget, we'll have a surplus of $40 million. The structural account is accounted for the fact that the way structural deficits are accounted for, they don't include tax cuts. They don't include the positive growth that happens from tax cuts. So that's purely, you finish year assuming there's no growth, which everybody, even the most conservative estimates, assume there's growth in there. That's why conservative estimates for growth show that there'll be a surplus at the end. You're technically right, but practically in terms of the implication. On the other part, in terms of and we've always in this state done bonding for major road projects. In this case, and why we were a little bit more creative, particularly with some of the projects here in southeastern Wisconsin, where we took it a step further, particularly with the GPR-funded or supported GEO bonds. It's because we have big projects. You saw what happened if we don't add another penny, and we just have the transportation budget as is today, you delay the zoo interchange. I don't need to tell you what the significant impact of that is on this region's economy, not just for the jobs, for the people working on the construction work there, but for the impact it has on others there. But by the same token, delaying other needed projects around the state wasn't a viable option. So what I looked at was, particularly when you think about the zoo as well as the home, the zoo interchange opened 4 years before I was born. This is not something we're doing every 5-10 years. It opened 4 years before I was born. At that pace, the next time, if we make this improvement, the next time on that pace, it'll need to be corrected is a couple years before I turned 100. So the reason I say that, Dan, is because this is literally one of those once-in-a-lifetime projects, both in size and in terms of the impact on that. And I think, unlike saying, oh, are you bonding for something that's going to be up and need to be fixed in 5 or 10 years? No, we're talking about a generational plus project here. And we tried to be creative in terms of tying in asset sales in the state. Yes, as we talked about, part of that is the power plants, but it would be, a good chunk of the excess land, the surplus land that we have as a state is actually DOT. DOT comes in when they do projects, they buy up huge amounts of it for obvious reasons, because if you're doing an interchange, you need to adjust an on or off ramp. But once those projects are completed, typically DOT sits on that land for quite some time. We're trying to accelerate that. Any of that money there, the power plants and anywhere else, would be used to pay off any debt issued on that. And then after that, it would be wide open to accelerate the repayment of the bonds.
On the first part, you're saying there won't be a deficit at the end of the...
Well, an actual there's a difference between the structural deficit and the deficit.
Right.
The budget ends with surplus. The structural deficit is intact, but in terms of the accounting for the state, you can't account for growth that comes off of a tax cut or any of the other pro-growth things that we've done.
You said earlier this week that the Republican Party would be smart to select a governor for president in 2016. Did you have anybody in mind? Where are you in terms of thinking about
There's
running
29 other great Republican governors out there.
Where are you? You haven't ruled that out, though, as a possibility of running for president.
The only thing I've said on that is that I had to work awfully hard twice in the last 2 years to become governor. I'm focused on being governor. And then somebody, just you're doing, Dan, pushed me in Washington a little bit, and they said, well, but what does that mean? I said, the nice thing, unlike being a senator, a member of Congress, or any other elected office, is governors only get talked about in those terms if they do a good job. If I do a really crappy job, nobody's going to talk about me in that context, or anybody else for that matter. So to the people of Wisconsin, there's no downside to me talking about, because the only reason they're talking about me is if we're doing really good things for the people of Wisconsin. If things are falling apart, if we're not doing a good job, people won't talk about it.
But you've not ruled it out.
I haven't even ruled in or out whether I'm running in 2014.
So speaking of some other governors, you said there are 29 other great governors. How do you feel about Governor Scott and Governor Christie changing course on Medicaid?
Every state's different. I mean, literally, and that's not just a push-off. Every state's different. States in general, but particularly when you look at Medicaid. I mean, in our case, we were, unlike a lot of other states, particularly in the South, but elsewhere, we were in a much better position to do what we did with Medicaid than just about anybody else, because my predecessor had moved up to 200% of the federal poverty level, the amount that Medicaid covered for childless adults. That put us in a much better, a different position than, say, other states that were far below that. Our state has a huge number of our people who are already, one of the highest percentages in the country, are already covered, who are not uninsured. So we had a small fraction. So what we were able to do was do something that changed the number of people who are on Medicaid. Although, as I mentioned, Governor Doyle moved the percentage up, but he still capped it off because he didn't put enough money in. So there is a whole group of childless adults who are eligible for Medicaid under Badger Care, but who are not in it because there wasn't enough money. It's been capped off. So we moved Medicaid down to what it was designed for, which is people living in poverty. For people living above it, we allow them to transition into the marketplace, which is either traditional or the exchanges. And then that's about 87,000. And for 82,000 people who were eligible, living in poverty, but were not getting it because they were capped under my predecessor, we moved them all into Medicaid. Going forward, everybody who's living in poverty will be eligible for Medicaid. There'll be 224,580 fewer people who are uninsured in the state. There'll be more people in the marketplace and in the exchanges, and we won't be on the hook for what many of us fear is what's likely to be changes that will affect the federal government. And just on that last point, think about it. I was just in Washington this past week where everybody was talking about the sequester. And everybody across the political spectrum acknowledged there's a deficit problem and a debt problem in the federal government. The question was how to solve it. Do you keep the sequester and all of its arbitrary cuts, as the president calls it? Do you provide an alternative, which I advocated for, saying, Mr. President, just like we had to do in states, why don't you provide better non-arbitrary cuts out there? Or do what the president's advocating, which is raise taxes through some changes he wants to make and make some cuts together. Nobody's saying we shouldn't make the cuts. Nobody's saying we don't have a deficit problem. So if they're saying we got to go through all this stuff to come up with $85 billion by tomorrow because we have a deficit problem, how in the same breath does that administration tell me and all the other governors, but don't worry about Medicaid in the future because we got more than enough money to cover this expansion? We were able to do all the things we wanted without putting our state and ultimately our taxpayers on the hook for those cuts.
Governor, can we circle back to school accountability for just a second? You said that there's legislation coming that's going to try to bring all the voucher schools, all the choice schools into the same report card system as the public schools. You had an opportunity to do that last session and you didn't. So why, first of all? And second, what should these private schools have to report publicly?
I think part of the last time was getting agreement with the legislature. It's why we're working directly with people like Steve Costell and others in the Assembly and the Senate who are involved. Were involved with our panel. It was Senator Olson as well to get something through. And it was the timing and the nature of dealing with that at the end of the legislative session. Going forward, I think it's imperative. And for us, what we want is an apples to apples comparison to the extent that we can, knowing it's not exactly that, but as close as we can in terms of, as you know, having followed this, our school and school district accountability system, these new report cards, was really done for two reasons. One, we wanted an effective, transparent, objective way to measure. And secondly, parallel to that is we wanted to offer an alternative to No Child Left Behind. Because we thought the idea of one high-stakes test that the federal government dictated really wasn't best for Wisconsin, and we wanted a more viable alternative to that. So we got that. It's going to continue to be tweaked and improved, but it's a much better project than what we had before, product than what we had before. And it covers a variety of things. It covers different areas. It covers both attainment and growth. To me, I'd love to see a parallel, because as a parent, thinking as a parent myself, if I was in a position where I had the opportunity to choose because of whatever, I'd want to know, okay, if my son or daughter is going into this school and I don't like what's happening there, first, what can I do to help improve that? And secondly, if it's not happening, what if I'm going to choose another school, be it a charter or a choice school or whatever, what's the difference? Because in both our public schools and in some of our voucher schools, there's claims made. And in some cases they can deliver on them. Others, I think it's been highly questionable. And so what I'd like for every parent of every student who has access to public funds for schools in the state, a parallel universe in terms of what they would see and how those report cards would project.
And if the special needs vouchers pass and those private schools also get public money, should they also be a part of the report card system?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think long term, because again, if this is not about different types of systems or different types of schools, it's ultimately about the students and the families. The best case scenario for those families is no. I mean, as an advocate in the past of choice, I still think there's some choice schools that I don't particularly care for. And I think the best way to weed them out is to clear, the more transparent and objective there is a system to say, here are the schools, here's how they perform. If the school is failing, whether it's a public school or a choice school, if parents are armed with that information, I think they're going to opt to go to different places. Right now, the challenge in both public and private schools is there's not enough of them that are armed with that information.
We have about 5 minutes left.
Governor, what do you think of Joe Sanfilippo's bill on reforming county government? And if it gets to your desk, do you think you'd sign it?
Well, I'll step back. The specifics of the bill, obviously are fluid. They keep different types of bills out there, different types of issues. So, as you guys have both reported, different issues in there. So I don't know that I can say a specific bill here, but I can tell you, as you know, when I ran for county executive more than a decade ago, I ran on giving part of my salary back because it was higher than the governor's at the time, which I did. I ran on reappointing and putting new people in county government. I ran on keeping the tax levy down from the previous year, and I ran on saying there should be a part-time board. So I don't think my position's changed any from when I ran for county executive. It just was a matter of what we could get through at the time and what was accomplished. Now, with the help of the state back then, I didn't get a part-time board, but I did get a greatly reduced board in terms of size. I still think it makes sense on behalf of the taxpayers here that, the 72 counties, 71 of them get by just fine, including a number that have not as big, but significant urban populations, be it in Dane or Waukesha or Brown or Kenosha or Racine County, get by with part-time boards. It seems to me that would be, perfectly responsible for Milwaukee.
One piece of the bill also talks about delineating the proper roles of both the executive and the board. Did you find that a problem, that those roles weren't spelled out well enough when you were executive?
There's a little bit of a challenge only because, as you can imagine, over the years, because county government started, well, one, as an arm of state government, and two, started out, up until, 59, there was no county executive anywhere.
Right.
And then after Milwaukee County required it, then you had 10 other counties that added it through a referendum, that sometimes the statutes conflict in terms of where things are really assigned for counties where the county board are the chief elected officials versus those with county executives. So I think, some clarification would be helpful. I do think that just practically in the larger context, part of the reason why that was more difficult than, say, any of the other counties that have county executives is because with a full-time county board, you have people that go out of their way to get engaged and involved in things that in other counties, if you're a part-time board, you're saying, hey, I'm going to focus my time on policy, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of micromanaging everything. And for you guys and Dave as well, having come in the past, you see a lot. Remember Jim Ryan, who I ran against, is a good man and got along with well, but we ran against each other in 2002. Jim Ryan had been part of a panel that looked at this. I think it was Jim Keyes was the chair of this long before I was county executive. And they mentioned the problems of the micromanagement. I think they remembered specifically the example was a shoeshine contract at the airport where there were 6, as I recall, don't quote me on it, but 6 different county board committee meetings on the shoeshine contract at the airport. And that was it was indicative. Their example was not only the county board shouldn't be involved, the county executive shouldn't be involved with it. The airport director should manage that. That's just how you effectively manage particularly larger governments. And over the years, it's not just this county board. It's been around for decades where there was just more and more control creeped into that. And I think from an administrative standpoint, having that delineation would be important, but also that's part of the benefit you get of a part-time versus a full-time board.
Governor, on the news of the day between the chief of the police and the sheriff, what do you make of it? Does it do anybody any good? And would you consider sitting down with these two men, since you know them, to try to have them iron out their differences?
I go back to the adage I mentioned before that I advise anyone to act on, and that is when I said to folks when I first came in the assembly after I'd been there for a while, was don't personalize your differences. Your opponent today may be your ally tomorrow. And people should never confuse that into thinking, I'm not saying don't advocate for what you believe in fiercely, but there's a difference between being a strong advocate on a given position versus being against someone. And I fear with a lot of things, not just in that example, but I fear, particularly in this region, there's a number of examples of where it's become far too personable. And, considering, and I think I can say that with some authority just because whether you all agree or disagree with the things I've done over the last 2 years, there's obviously been a lot of personal attacks against me and my family, but I've tried to ensure, hopefully the best thing I've passed on to my children is even in times like that, don't respond in kind. Stand up for your principles. Don't back from those, but don't ever make it a personal issue. And that would be my advice. And if, for them or anybody else who's in the same position, if it was, if there was any benefit, I don't want to inject myself into something where I become more of a problem than a help. But there or anywhere else, if I can pass on that advice, that's the advice I'd give.
Is the fight between the sheriff and Abley, though, embarrassing to the county and to the state?
I don't know if it's embarrassing. I just think it's the example I tried to lay out. The message I just gave, I think, is the preferable route. You can always be passionate on your position. Excuse me. You can. Again, I don't think anyone could question where I stand on issues, and that I have the willingness to back them up. But I hope you've all seen. I hope the people of the state have seen that I'm not going to go out of my way to, no matter how hard people attack me, that I'm going to be. Try to be, I always say above that sounds condescending, and I don't mean that, but to operate on a higher plane. I would encourage any leader, whether it's here in Milwaukee County or anywhere else across the state, to try and live by that, because I think that's what our people deserve. They deserve a good debate, they deserve good conduct, but they deserve people who are going to be respectful of those who don't agree with it.
You've been critical over the past week of the congressional Republicans, pretty strongly critical of them. Do you think that Representative Ryan's provided adequate leadership on the sequester and on the budget deficit issue?
I haven't really thought about that with Paul, but
I mean, he is a member of the leadership.
It's difficult. I was talking with, of all things, Art Laffer the other day. Remember, Laffer was the Laffer curve advisor to Reagan, and he had an interesting insight. He said, one of the challenges House Republicans have was almost identical to what Tip O'Neill and the House Democrats had in the early 80s, where President Reagan was running circles around them. He had a Republican Senate, Republican President, House. We forget about that here because the legislature, Assembly and Senate aren't that much different. The House and the Senate are so much different. The House, by its nature, regardless of party, is kind of the defense mechanism. They don't get to initiate things, they can kind of block things. And so by its nature, it's similar. People forget that 4 years ago when President Obama, then candidate Obama, invoked Reagan, some people mistakenly thought that was a sign of trying to show he was moderating positions. What it was respect for the tactics, the strategy of President Reagan, which he's using, ironically, almost to undo the Reagan Revolution. But I got asked this the other day at the White House on the way out from an AP reporter who was commenting about somebody else's, or asked me about somebody else's comments that was criticizing the president in terms of he was still campaigning a little bit. I said, the one thing I'll give him credit on, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but this president is standing up for what he believes in. Much as I just mentioned when you asked me about others here, I will honor that. I think that's an honorable thing to do, that he passionately believes this. Now, he believes, I believe, he hasn't said this, but I believe he believes the measure of success in government is by how many people are dependent on the government. I believe the measure of success in government is the opposite, by how many fewer people are dependent. Not because I want to kick people out in the streets, but because I think ultimately the best way to empower people is not through more government dependency, it's through true independence, and you get that through the dignity of the job in the private sector where you control your own destiny and your own livelihood, and that leads to true freedom and prosperity. But those are two very different views, and not to equate it to Paul, but I think in general somebody in Washington needs to offer that as an alternative. And I just don't think that's coming through, and that's why I've been critical.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate it. Please
Thank
come
you
back
all.
soon.
Will do. Thanks.